The deep abyss appears when the atmosphere contains a certain concentration of mana. The abyss connects to the demon realm. The deeper the connection, the more terrifying monsters emerge. On that night, a level 12 abyss appeared in his hometown, and at this level, it was already called a king. It mercilessly slaughtered all the citizens in the city. At this time, an old knight decided he must go into battle. Before that, he had called his granddaughter Noel to give her careful instruction. He ordered Noel to stay safely in the underground shelter. Only there would she be safe. Noel absolutely refused. Who knew if the imperial capital would send troops to help them or not? The knight smiled and patted Noel's head encouragingly. People feared him by the name Over Death, and this immortal knight was ready to risk his life just to protect his granddaughter. With those words, he turned and left. Overcharged straight into the horde of monsters while still smiling. Being a man, he would never allow others to look down on him, regardless of the circumstances. The battle between the two sides was fierce. Explosions thundered through the sky, while Noel could only sit in the shelter, holding her head in fear. When the loud noises finally stopped, the little girl dared to venture out of the shelter to look for her grandfather. Monster corpses were everywhere, and overlay in the middle of a mountain of their bodies. Although severely wounded, he was still alive. Noel burst into tears and hurriedly ran to help her grandfather up. Over looked at Noel tenderly and uttered, "No one can escape age. Once you take up weapons to fight, death will always be by your side." Once again, he had to ask Noel, now that she had witnessed these things, whether she still was determined to follow his path. Noel gritted her teeth and swore to him that she would become the strongest seeker on this continent. With that, he was at peace and took his last breath in Noel's arms. His real name was Stolen, the strongest seeker on the continent. Years ago, he had single-handedly slain a level 13 abyss, earning the nickname Immortal Devil. 2 years had passed since that event ended. Noel had kept her promise to her grandfather and had now become a seeker. Noel's battle took place in a cave. Noel ordered Lloyd and Walter to confront the monster, while Tanya provided support from behind. As the monster charged forward, Tanya immediately cast a light spell, blinding it and forcing it to retreat. Walter and Lloyd seized the opportunity to finish it off immediately. Noel just stood with her arms folded, smiling. The talksmith was the weakest profession, which was also the profession Noel had received. The monsters they had just faced were vampires, but they were only a low-level type, so they couldn't use magic. In exchange, their queen had powerful reproductive magic, allowing her to produce as many soldiers as she wanted. While thinking, a vampire that wasn't completely dead jumped at Noel, trying to attack her. Fortunately, Tanya noticed in time and saved her life. Afterward, the group continued deeper into the cave. As they walked, Walter complained that killing these low-level vampires was a waste of time. He thought it would be faster to find and kill the queen directly. When the queen died, these vampires would be like headless snakes. Noel immediately refused. Their commission was beyond level C, and to increase the team's survival rate, Noel had come up with this safe and reliable plan. Walter continued to joke around, but even though he didn't like it, in this team, Noel's words carried the most weight. The talksmith had the ability to buff teammates' strength through commands, but in exchange, their combat power was very low, requiring them to rely on teammates to fight monsters. Because of this, Noel was often criticized for being weak. Noel was angry when she saw Walter continuing to provoke her. She was about to scold him when she noticed something was wrong. She turned around sharply and shouted for everyone to duck. The vampire queen attacked them from the ceiling, spewing a toxic mist that separated the team from Noel. Noel was surrounded by the toxic mist and couldn't move. Lloyd and Walter were about to rush to save Noel when the vampire queen jumped down to attack them. The two worked together to fight, but couldn't inflict any damage on it. Without Noel's buff, they couldn't defeat this creature. Walter shouted loudly, asking if Noel was okay. Noel now remembered her grandfather and the criticisms of her weakness, which made her very annoyed. She couldn't let anyone look down on her. Noel took a gun from her bag and shot to disperse the toxic mist. Then came the talksmith's buff skills. First, buffing all team members' strength by 25%, then buffing endurance and magic power by 25% as well. After enhancing the whole team, Noel jumped behind Tanya and started deploying everyone to fight. Tanya would still stand back using a shield buff to protect Walter and Lloyd as they fought. Suddenly, Tanya noticed there was an ambush above their heads, which made her a bit scared. Noel quickly buffed Tanya's mental strength so she could continue supporting Walter's group. Noel could handle these low-level vampires herself. the vampires swooped down to attack Noel. Noel shouted loudly, causing them all to be stunned. The gun Noel held in her hand was the magic gun Silver, the only weapon that a talksmith like her could use for self-defense. Noel fired a shot that froze the vampires, but one escaped and was charging towards her. Nevertheless, Noel remained very calm as she calculated the timing. She had one bullet left and a full 28 seconds before the monster could attack her. Noel smiled. That was enough time. Instead of shooting the low-level vampire, Noel turned to shoot the queen, creating an opportunity for Walter and Lloyd to launch a combined attack that finished it off immediately. Before the low-level vampire's claws could reach her, the queen died, and had stopped functioning. Afterward, the whole team criticized Noel for her overly risky plan. Noel didn't care. At that moment, she only remembered her grandfather. When she was young, she had cried a lot because of the talksmith profession. Seeing this, her grandfather just laughed loudly and encouraged her. There was one point where Noel was very similar to her mother. She was a crybaby. The difference was that Noel had the talent of a natural-born seeker, which is why her grandfather promised to train her to become the strongest seeker. And now, Noel was still moving toward that goal. She would become the strongest seeker, surpassing even her grandfather, even if her profession was a talksmith. After completing the extermination mission, the group headed back to the imperial capital, Betrayal. They had a celebratory feast for this mission. A bit about Noel's team: warrior Walter, healer Tanya, and swordsman Lloyd. After turning 15, Noel had made her way to the imperial capital Betrayal and found these teammates. The team had been operating smoothly for a year now, and this was the first step for Noel to fulfill her dream. In the middle of the feast, Noel didn't seem happy at all. So Walter teased her, noting that earlier he had seen Noel haggling over every penny with the mission giver, which confused Walter a bit, and he advised her that as a seeker, she should be more generous. Immediately, Noel glared at Walter, because her grandfather had taught her that as a seeker, one must be obsessed with money. With money, one could buy the best equipment. Without money, one couldn't reach the top. At this point, Tanya spoke up to help Noel, but Walter kept pushing, demanding that Noel give up her money-grubbing habit, or the whole team would get a bad reputation. Noel didn't care and retorted back at Walter, which made Walter very angry. The two argued loudly in the restaurant and almost fought, with Lloyd having to step in to stop them. After the feast, they all went to collect their reward. For such a big mission, after deducting various costs, each person received only 250,000 dong. Tanya was a bit unhappy with this amount. Lloyd held her hand to comfort her, saying it was okay, they would take on more missions like this and would make money again. But Noel didn't want to take on more missions like this. Each time their team accepted a mission, they had to go through a clan, and after going through the clan, they would be subject to heavy deductions, leaving them with very little in the end. Noel knew very well that the special missions assigned by the imperial capital had all been taken by these clans, and only the mediocre missions were passed on to them. Because of this, Noel wanted to use the team's funds to create a new clan. She would cover any shortfall. Tanya was a bit afraid and advised Noel against it, saying they were just a new team and probably couldn't manage it. Lloyd thought the same way. They were too young, and it wasn't certain that the Empire would trust them and assign them tasks. Noel had calculated this very carefully. The imperial capital Betrayal was a place that directed citizens towards the seeker profession. They were young and strong, they would pioneer the way, allowing others to follow, and that was when they could make money. For example, in the top clans, there were mostly young seekers. At this point, Walter agreed with Noel. Continuing to struggle like this wasn't good. Establishing their own clan and reaching the top would be better. So the two sides confronted each other. Noel would not compromise on this issue alone. If Tanya and Lloyd didn't agree, she would take back her money and leave the team immediately. Lloyd thought for a while and then agreed, arranging for everyone to discuss further the day after tomorrow at noon. Afterward, everyone went to their own homes. However, a variable Noel had never thought of occurred. At noon on the appointed day, Walter hurriedly ran over to give Noel a letter. Tanya and Lloyd had betrayed them. In the letter was a belated apology that Lloyd had left for his two teammates. He had lost money on investments and had used the team's funds to cover the loss. Now that Noel wanted to use that money, Lloyd didn't know how to explain, so he decided to run away. Reading this, Noel burst into laughter. She couldn't believe that their Lloyd, who always acted gallant with women, was such a coward. Walter was very upset and wondered why Noel was still laughing. After laughing heartily, Noel curiously asked Walter how he got this letter. Walter explained that he had received a notification that the tavern where Lloyd rented a room was hiring, so Walter had gone there to apply for a job. That's when the tavern owner gave him the letter. Lloyd and Tanya had left around 8 p.m. last night. It was now 10 a.m. Nearly half a day had passed. Walter was very angry and determined to beat Lloyd to a pulp once they found him. Noel smiled at Walter's naive thinking, then grabbed his collar and reminded him that their goal was to get the money back, not to beat them up. If Lloyd had decided to run away, then beating him wouldn't get the money back and might even lead to a deadly fight. Walter listened but still didn't understand. Would Noel really let it go? Of course not. Noel's face showed an evil smile. Her revenge against people like them would be terrifying. Afterward, Noel and Walter went to the tavern. Before entering, Noel had to remind Walter once again. Walter might be stupid, but he wasn't useless. Everyone had their own mission, and tasks requiring brains should be left to her. Noel opened the tavern door, walked in, and shouted loudly that she had a commission for all the seekers present. The targets were Lloyd and Tanya. Whichever team caught them, she would reward with $2 million. Walter was startled and hurriedly tried to stop Noel, saying that by announcing it like this, these people wouldn't respect them. Noel didn't care. There were some things she couldn't reveal to Walter right now. After a while, the Lightning Bite team accepted this mission. Noel exchanged some information with them. She didn't know which direction Lloyd and Tanya had fled, but she was certain they were on foot. If so, those present could easily catch up to them on horseback. As soon as the Lightning Guild accepted the commission, other guilds began to accept it as well. Shortly after, the tavern was completely empty of customers. But Noel wasn't happy at all because this wasn't her purpose. As she was about to leave, a middle-aged man called Noel over to discuss the commission further. Noel smirked. Finally, the fish had taken the bait. The man led Noel and Walter to a secluded corner to discuss the two people Noel was looking for. Last night, he had passed by two people, and he was sure they were the ones Noel was looking for. Walter eagerly wanted more information, but the seeker didn't say anything more, only demanding payment up front. At this point, Noel spoke up, not to beg the man but to negotiate the price. The commission she had offered had a reward of $2 million for the team that caught the two, but this man had called her over to discuss further. This meant his team wasn't strong enough to catch the two on their own and needed Noel and Walter's help. If that was the case, Noel would only pay $1 million. The seeker was sweating profusely when he heard this, saying it should be at least $1.5 million. But Noel was firm. $1 million meant $1 million. The reason Noel bargained so hard was that she had assessed the man from head to toe as soon as they met. He was a washed-up seeker with poor equipment, and his physique wasn't impressive either, so he was likely very desperate and couldn't freely choose jobs for his team. Left with no choice, the old seeker finally agreed. The two people they were looking for had gone through the south gate, and he was sure they would have to pass through the village of Krenot. With this information, Noel had Walter and the man's team gather at the south gate, while she went to finish some unfinished business. A long while later, Noel returned. At the same time, Lloyd and Tanya had reached the village of Krenot. As they walked, he encouraged Tanya, saying it was fine. He knew Noel's character. Once Noel understood he couldn't get the money back, he wouldn't risk looking for them. As soon as he finished speaking, Noel was already standing behind them. She used a skill to paralyze the two and tied them up immediately. Walter was angry at being betrayed by Lloyd and was about to beat him up when Noel stopped him, saying they needed to verify a few things first. In the letter, Lloyd had confessed to losing money on investments, but Noel knew full well that he had lost it gambling, not investing. He had gambled and borrowed at high interest rates, and all the team's money had been used to pay off the debt. Lloyd immediately shouted, cursing at them, saying that the job of leader bore an enormous pressure, and if they didn't know anything, they shouldn't criticize him. Noel immediately kicked Lloyd in the mouth, reminding him that from the beginning, it was Lloyd who had taken the responsibility of being the leader. No one had pushed that responsibility onto him. After being kicked and spitting blood, Lloyd became afraid and begged for forgiveness. Noel just smiled and said forgiveness. He would have to endure 1,000 blows from her before they could discuss it further. Tanya was frightened but still begged for help for Lloyd. At this point, Noel turned to use a skill to make Tanya tell the truth. It turned out that she and Lloyd had gone gambling together and lost all the team's funds. The crime of embezzling team funds, according to imperial law, would result in 10 years in prison. 10 years in prison would be devastating. Noel laughed loudly. At this point, seeing that they had finished talking, The old seeker ran over to ask Noel for payment. Noel sternly reminded him that she would pay, but only after she had finished her business. Despite being told this, the man still thought Noel was trying to trick him and drew a knife to attack her. Immediately, Noel gave him a punch that made him foam at the mouth. The technique she had just used was a heart shock taught by her grandfather. This skill created a strong shock just above the heart stem, causing it to temporarily stop functioning. No matter how tough someone was, this blow would knock them out. This was a special skill her grandfather had taught Noel, a skill that allowed a talksmith like her to protect herself. The old seeker fainted after this attack and was carried away by his team. At the same time, a luxurious horse-drawn carriage arrived. A flamboyantly dressed man stepped down from the carriage, but just by looking, everyone present immediately recognized him. He was a slave merchant. Noel also knew very well about him. He was the assistant to the Mafia boss, a notorious organization in the imperial capital. Outwardly, he seemed cheerful like this, but inside he was extremely evil, known by the nickname Finaccio, the Mad Clown. Now Walter understood why Noel had left earlier. Seeing this, Noel also explained, she knew very well that Lloyd and Tanya had no money to repay, so she had made a deal with Finaccio to compensate for the lost money. Or in other words, she would sell Lloyd and Tanya to him. Tanya heard this and broke out in a cold sweat, disagreeing, but at this point, she had no right to decide. Option 1 was to follow Finaccio as a slave. Option 2 was to go to prison for 10 years. And once in prison, their survival rate would be even lower than as slaves. Tanya was speechless and couldn't do anything more. Seeing this, Finaccio happily came forward to inspect the merchandise. 2 young, healthy people, and he was only paying 6 million dong. This price was so cheap that even Noel was surprised. Finaccio, although wanting to pay Noel more, said this was a bad time. He whispered in Noel's ear, revealing that just a few days ago, the church had issued a rule against extravagance. If he were to spend a larger sum to buy slaves now, he would certainly be caught. Noel sighed deeply, having no choice. She decided to sell these 2 to Finaccio for 11 million dong. Finaccio didn't understand and questioned Noel, but with each word he uttered, she increased the price by 1 million. When the price reached 15 million, Finaccio became angry and grabbed Noel's collar, threatening her. Of course, Noel had no intention of confronting Finaccio. She was just creating a business opportunity for him. In this time of prohibition, 2 slaves purchased by the slave master himself at an astronomical price would certainly attract the attention of the wealthy. Moreover, these 2 were very good looking. At that time, Finaccio would only need to raise the price to make a large profit. 15 million was already very favorable for Finaccio. Hearing this, he understood Noel's intention. Although raising prices was prohibited, only a few people here knew about the transaction, so Finaccio agreed to buy them for 15 million, and then turned to threaten the old Seekers group not to disclose this matter. The transaction was completed, and Tanya and Lloyd were taken away. Even though Tanya screamed and begged for forgiveness, Noel remained firm. Having betrayed once, there would inevitably be a second time. As promised, Noel paid exactly 1 million to the old Seekers group. Although they had received the money, Noel's way of doing business made the group very angry. She was both dictatorial and evil. They cursed Noel, calling her a devil. But Noel wasn't angry at all because in the Seeker world, being evil was part of becoming stronger, and she would stick to that ideal to develop. The next day, Walter took off his armor and stood before the imperial capital's gate. Noel personally came to throw him a bottle of wine. Last night, Walter had asked Noel's permission to stop being a Seeker. Although Noel had tried to persuade him, Walter had lost all hope in this profession, so Walter would give up and return to his hometown. Seeing this, Noel didn't force Walter anymore. After handing the wine bottle to Walter, she immediately left. Looking down at the city from above, Noel could only sigh. From now on, she would have to start over. At this moment, Noel saw the shed skin of a snake. Snakes need to shed their skin to become stronger, just like Noel now. She would change the members of her team and become stronger. On the streets of the imperial capital Atri, a white-haired girl kept staring at the bulletin board. Then she smiled. Finally, she had found Noel. Meanwhile, Noel was sitting in a tavern with Wolf, the leader of the Lightning Bite team. Wolf kept advising Noel to give up, saying that sitting here waiting wouldn't be effective because none of the people coming to this tavern would be without a team or clan. Noel didn't care and told Wolf he talked too much, driving him away. Of course, Wolf wouldn't give up so easily. He knew that a talksmith like Noel couldn't fight alone. so he always welcomed Noel to join his team. Noel knew Wolf's lightning bite team very well. Wolf was both the team leader and swordsman. Alongside him was a very capable elf archer, and the others were equally skilled. Although only a C-level team, it was a team with great potential. Wolf continued to invite Noel, suggesting that instead of sitting here recruiting new members, he should just join Wolf's team. Wouldn't that be both faster and more profitable? At this point, the elf archer Lisha spoke up to stop Wolf, saying that's why Wolf's flirting always failed. This made Wolf very embarrassed, just as he was about to use his persuasion skill on Noel. Noel agreed to join, but with one condition: he would be the leader of the team. Without even waiting for Wolf's agreement, all the members in the team immediately nodded, reasoning that Noel was much smarter than Wolf, so it was perfectly logical to have Noel as the team leader. Although it sounded reasonable, Wolf had held this position since the team's founding, and if he didn't do it, what should he do now? Just then, a voice from behind called out to Noel, startling everyone to their feet. Even someone with perceptive abilities like Lisha hadn't noticed this person approaching so closely. The woman removed her hat and introduced herself as Alma. She had seen Noel's recruitment notice, which is why she came. So Noel's interview with Alma began. The first question Noel asked was about her age, and fortunately Alma was easygoing and still answered Noel, saying she was 5 years older than him. This was followed by countless silly questions from Wolf's group. But what Noel cared about most was Alma's profession. A Class C Scout was exactly what he wanted. For the final question, Noel wanted to know why she became a Seeker. Alma shared honestly that she wasn't interested in being a Seeker, only in the grandson of Overdeath, which was Noel. Years ago, Alma's grandfather had dueled with Noel's grandfather and had lost an arm to Noel's grandfather, and his name was Alker. As soon as she finished speaking, everyone in the tavern was shocked. Noel was also sweating because this person was too famous. He belonged to the Assassin Sect, a sect that was ready to kill anyone when commissioned. Alker was also the first chairman, a legendary assassin in the profession. At this point, Logan, a tall, dark, smelly man in the tavern, stood up abruptly and scolded Alma, saying he didn't believe she was Alker's grandson because Alma hadn't been recognized as a Seeker. So Alma turned to ask Noel what she should do to become a Seeker. This was simple. Alma just needed to prove her abilities to others. Alma immediately understood the issue. Wasn't there someone right here for her to prove herself against? Alma challenged Logan, calling him a monkey, which made Logan furious. He rushed to attack Alma, but somehow this girl was too quick and nimble. With just 2 strikes, she knocked Logan out, to everyone's surprise. Noel's lips curled up in a smile but wouldn't close. He recruited Alma into his team immediately. It was also at this time that Alma's stomach growled loudly from hunger, so Noel had to take her elsewhere to treat her to fried buns. Now Noel truly believed that Alma was the granddaughter of the legendary assassin. At first, he didn't believe it at all, but Alma only needed to see Noel's face to believe in him immediately, because Noel's eyes were eyes that were ready to do anything to achieve results. In the past, her grandfather had once reminded her of a warning: never confront Overdeath directly. Confronting him would only result in defeat. Looking at Noel's eyes reminded Alma of those warnings. Noel was now confused and wondered about Alma. With her abilities and background, why didn't she join the assassin organization and instead came here to be a Seeker? Alma sighed deeply and honestly confessed to Noel. Initially, she had planned to do just that, but there was a problem in the promotion test. Alma's opponent in the test was too weak. She had defeated him with just a few strikes. Alma still remembered clearly what her grandfather had taught her. Once in battle, you must take your opponent's life. And just as Alma was about to finish him off, Saman, the newly appointed leader of the Assassin Sect, stopped her. Alma's killing intent made Saman feel she wasn't suitable for the current sect, so he expelled her immediately. Of course, her abilities had already been recognized. While biting into a bun, Alma lamented that it was because Saman was in charge of the organization that a major reform was taking place there. He had completely abandoned the old concepts of the Assassin Sect and now wanted to pursue a different goal: to cling to the umbrella of the Empire, to become a guild recognized by the Imperial capital, no longer operating in the shadows, and also shifting their objective from killing to intelligence activities. Noel was sweating as he heard this. This was classified information, not something to be casually shared while eating buns. Noel was a bit worried, wondering if now that he had heard this, would he be eliminated? Alma just smiled confidently, patting her chest, assuring that as long as she was here, Noel would be safe. Since Alma had always operated alone, she didn't know how group combat worked, so Noel had to provide her with a crash course. He took Alma up the mountain, explaining the abilities of a talksmith as they walked. His buffing power was very strong and could change the entire situation of a battle. But in return, if he misjudged, the whole team would be in danger immediately. So the key here was the absolute trust of the members, ready to follow any order Noel gave. Most talksmiths don't have combat abilities, but Noel was different. He still had tricks to protect himself, otherwise he would have been dead long ago. Noel took Alma to a nearby stream and began his training. Alma's task would be to catch the horned rabbits around there. Of course, with Alma's skills, catching them would be simple. But the purpose of this training was to test Alma's adaptability to the talksmith's buff. Scouts have an initial skill of increasing their own speed, but to maximize it, they need to practice to make their bodies familiar with the buff. Noel's buff worked the same way. His old team took a whole month to get used to this type of buff. Based on Alma's performance, Noel would plan the next actions. Alma received the order and got to work immediately. She used her observation skill to detect a total of 13 horned rabbits within a 200-meter radius. Noel assigned her the task of catching just one and bringing it back within 10 seconds to pass the test. Noel buffed her strength, and Alma also increased her speed and rushed off. 10 seconds for one rabbit was a bit much. Alma only needed 8 seconds to catch all 13 and bring them back to Noel, which made him break out in a sweat. This level of skill must be innate. No one could adapt so quickly. So the evaluation test was completed, and Alma scored perfectly. Next, Noel would assign Alma her first mission to work with him. From his pocket, he pulled out a commission sent from the village of Mint. Lately, bandits had appeared there, and the first mission of the new team would be to hunt them down. Since the road to Mint Village was very far, on the way, Noel also explained simply about the seeker job to Alma. Although they were seekers, not all seekers had to fight the abyss. They were divided into many types of work, such as hunting mutated monsters, hunting bandits, digging for treasures, or exploring relics. Their job this time was to eliminate bandits. Originally, that was the task of the local lord, but they acted very slowly. By the time help arrived, the village would have nothing left. The people who commissioned Noel were poor farmers, so Noel didn't expect much in terms of reward. He just used it as an opportunity to test his new team. After sitting for a whole long day and still not reaching Mint Village, they had to spend the night at a town on the way. Because they arrived too late, all the rooms had been rented out. Noel had to search extensively to find a single room with only one bed, so Noel gallantly gave it to Alma while he would sleep on the floor. A while later, Noel emerged from the bathroom. Looking at Noel's muscular body, Alma couldn't help but exclaim what a pity it was that Noel's profession wasn't oriented towards combat. So no matter how much he trained, he couldn't compare with others. Alma wished Noel had the same profession as his grandfather. Then by now, Noel would have become the strongest seeker. Noel immediately asked Alma to close her eyes, then flicked her forehead hard for the offense of caring about unnecessary things, though pretending not to be angry. That night, Noel lay tossing and turning, unable to sleep. What Alma had just explained, Noel understood very well. He himself had once cried because of his profession. After a restful evening, the next day Noel and Alma arrived at the village. The village chief happily came out to welcome Noel, but when he didn't see the others from the old team anywhere, he was a bit puzzled. After learning that they had all left the team, the village chief's face showed some concern. Noel knew this already and quickly reassured him that currently his team only consisted of himself and Alma, but he would still complete the task of eliminating the bandits today. Noel and Alma were invited in for tea. Noel very kindly greeted the village chief's daughter. The little girl hiding in a corner saw Noel looking at her and immediately ran away. The village chief could only smile and explained on behalf of his daughter. Though the girl seemed shy, actually, when she heard that Noel was coming, she had been very eager to meet him. Enough small talk. Noel wanted to remind about the payment before setting off. The deposit he would receive in advance would be 200,000 dong, with the remaining 300,000 to be received after completing the mission. The village chief paid without any hesitation, which surprised Noel a bit. It seemed they had been saving just to deal with these bandits. Then the village chief provided information to Noel. There were about 20 bandits in the group. They killed people and robbed properties in the surrounding villages. And not only that, they also kidnapped women. Noel knew quite well about the way these bandits lived. Though they were bandits, they must have a hideout, and the village chief guessed they would be in the forest to the east. Noel received the information and set off immediately. As soon as they left the village chief's house, Alma immediately scolded him, saying his wife and children were sitting right beside him. Yet he kept staring at her chest. At this moment, the village chief's daughter ran after them to cheer Noel on to complete the mission. Then she held out a bamboo pinwheel. The last time Noel visited their village, he had taught the children how to make this toy. The bamboo pinwheel before him was the gift that Noel had given to the little girl, and she had kept it as her treasure. Saying this, she became so embarrassed that she ran back immediately. Alma looked at Noel with her mouth curling up, saying Noel might seem decent, but she didn't expect him to seduce a little lowly like this. Noel didn't bother to answer, just scolded Alma, and they all set off together. By evening, Noel had found the bandits' lair. The village chief's information was completely wrong. There were at least twice the estimated number. Very quickly, Noel detected the leader of the bandits. His face looked familiar, and after thinking for a while, Noel remembered. This was Gordon the Razor, a wanted criminal with a bounty of 2 million dong, a Class B scout. Noel turned to ask Alma if she was confident she could defeat him. Alma wasn't sure she could handle all those bandits, but if it was a solo fight with the leader, she was confident she could win. For Noel, that was good enough. He had a plan to prevent the soldiers from being able to help their leader. The plan began with Noel using his skill to share information with Alma, a skill that would allow him to talk to Alma even from a distance. Alma took position right behind the leader's tent. Upon receiving the information, Noel immediately used his roaring skill, paralyzing all the bandits in the area. Just waiting for this, Alma rushed into the tent and stabbed the leader with a fatal blow. The next command, Noel ordered Alma to hold off the soldiers until he arrived. Though saying "hold off" was an understatement, as Alma was more than capable of cleaning up the place. Noel used a rope to swing down and threw flares into the faces of the bandits, blinding them, followed by a series of fire bullets that incinerated them. So the bandit elimination was completed. Noel brought the leader's head back as proof to the village chief. When he mentioned the payment, the chief invited Noel to dinner first. Reluctantly, since they had already prepared the meal, Noel and Alma graciously joined in the celebration. During the meal, the village chief boasted to Noel that his daughter had the profession of a swordsman, and also had the aspiration to become a seeker. So Noel explained thoroughly everything she needed to do to become a seeker. First, she had to be of age, then she had to attend the training school in the imperial capital to gain experience. However, this would cost a lot of money. So Noel encouraged the girl to become an intern at other seeker teams, or more accurately, to be their errand runner. The little girl listened attentively from beginning to end, then asked Noel if, when she became a seeker, would Noel agree to let her join his team. Noel just smiled and reminded the girl that if by then he was still a seeker as she hoped, he would be very happy to welcome her into the team. At this point, the village chief brought out a bottle of wine to offer to Noel and Alma, with the reason of celebrating his daughter's desire to become a seeker. After pouring the wine, he kept urging Noel and Alma to drink. Noel just smiled and pushed the wine bottle back towards him, saying that when offering wine, the host should drink first, otherwise it would be very disrespectful. Seeing the village chief hesitate, Noel just stated outright that how could anyone drink this poisoned wine. Hearing this, the village chief and his wife were so frightened they immediately backed away. He vehemently denied it, but Noel knew very well. There were 3 points that led him to this conclusion. First, the chief had lied about the number of bandits to avoid paying more for the job. Second, just by smelling, he knew there was something else in the wine. And third, when offering the wine, he had revealed his killing intent. Noel pushed the wine glass towards him, forcing him to drink it if he wanted to prove Noel wrong. At this point, the village chief knocked the wine glass away, then immediately scolded Noel for falsely accusing him and drove him out of the house. Noel didn't bother with formalities anymore and immediately used his skill to make the chief confess the truth. This man had planned beforehand to assassinate Noel and Alma here to steal all their money and equipment. From his own mouth, he had confessed the truth, so Noel rushed forward and gouged out his left eye. Not just the left eye. Having targeted Noel, he should be prepared to be tortured slowly. Now the man became frightened and cried, begging Noel for forgiveness. He said he did it only to save his family. He owed money to the Mafia, and if he didn't pay in time, his whole family would be killed. Noel didn't care and was preparing to gouge out his other eye when the chief's daughter brought out all their possessions, begging Noel to spare her father's life. Noel took the money and told Alma to leave, ignoring how the little girl gritted her teeth and cursed Noel as a devil. On the way, while Noel's face remained expressionless, Alma spoke up to tease him, asking if making a girl who once admired him turn like that didn't make Noel feel guilty. Of course, Noel's answer was no. In this seeker world, if you want to live, you have to be evil and endure similar things. Just then, a gigantic airship flew past in front of them. Noel recognized it immediately as the airship of the 3-star Regalia Guild, one of the 7 guilds recognized by the Emperor as powerful. Among these 7 guilds, some were stronger and some were slightly weaker, so they were divided into 3 positions. First were the 4 guilds ranked as 3-star, then 2 2-star guilds, and 1 1-star guild. That huge airship was a benefit of the 3-star guild, carrying countless powerful seekers. Now Noel had a goal for himself. Within the next year, he would join this Regalia Guild. Hearing Noel declare this, Alma remembered the conversation between her and the new assassin sect leader Saman. He knew that Alma was the one who had killed her grandfather Alker. Yet Alma felt no remorse at all because he had become so weak that someone like her had the ability to kill him. A tiger that loses its claws can't swim by itself. Moreover, Alma hated Alker very much. She wasn't his granddaughter, but his biological daughter. He had kidnapped young girls and forced them to give birth to Alma and countless other children. Though she was his child, he didn't care about them at all, only wanting to train one of them to inherit his strength and will, to erase the stain of defeat before over death. After that defeat, he had become severely obsessed, and it was this obsession that had killed Alma's siblings. She was the only survivor and also the most capable one. Hearing this, Saman decided to expel Alma from the assassin sect. There was no place for Alma here anymore. Though she had strength, it was precisely this strength that made Saman worry that one day Alma would be a threat to the entire sect. Alma burst into tears, wondering what purpose her 21 years of enduring hardship and training should serve now. Alma angrily shouted, but Saman didn't care. He only gave her one piece of advice. From now on, live according to her own preferences. Furthermore, he had heard that the grandson of Overdeath was working as a seeker in the imperial capital. If Alma was interested, she should go meet him, and Alma had followed that advice. At this moment, Alma rushed forward and hugged Noel tightly. She smiled brightly and declared that she would fight alongside him forever. Noel heard this but was bewildered, not understanding what was happening at all. At the imperial capital's prison, there was an incident. An intruder illegally entered the prison, knocked out an officer, dragged him into the bathroom to hide, and then transformed into his appearance. The transformation was so perfect that even colleagues couldn't detect anything unusual. He then approached a cell containing a notorious murderer, the puppet knight Hugo. Meanwhile, Noel was already running around the imperial capital with weights early in the morning. His daily target was to complete 2 full circuits. No matter how tired he was, he couldn't skip training. Since he had declared his desire to become a seeker to his grandfather, Overdeath had lost the gentle demeanor of a grandfather, leaving only harsh training regimens. Compared to when he was training with his grandfather, these 2 laps around the city walls were nothing. After training, Noel returned to his lodging to bathe. While standing, he recalled what Alma had told him before about having a strong body, but unfortunately having the talksmith profession. Though not showing it outwardly, Noel felt very uncomfortable about this. Just as he finished bathing and stepped out, someone knocked on the door. It was Alma coming to find Noel. She had clearly arrived earlier than the appointed time, which confused Noel a bit. Alma thought that Noel would be happy to see her, but Noel's reaction was completely opposite to Alma's expectation. Before Noel could agree, Alma had already pinned him down on the bed, wanting to feel his chest muscles. Noel tried his best to tense up his body to escape, but Alma was too strong, and he had no chance. The more Alma looked at Noel, the cuter she found him, and she wanted to kiss him. Of course, Noel wouldn't allow that to happen. He shouted loudly and headbutted Alma. Afterward, they both set out to start the new day. As they walked, Alma complained that despite being the older sister, how could a man be so rough with a woman? That principle applied to others, but with Noel, he didn't distinguish between men and women and treated everyone the same. At this moment, Alma saw a couple walking past with their arms linked. So Alma imitated them, sliding over to link arms with Noel, and then curiously asked about his schedule for today. Noel thought for a moment and decided to go to the Seeker Assessment Guild. This was a special profession that one had from birth, but such people couldn't level up like others. Alma had previously intended to level up to become an assassin, but as soon as Noel heard her wish, he had to advise Alma against it. Indeed, when Alma leveled up to become an assassin, Her combat power would increase dramatically, but it was also necessary to consider whether it would be suitable for future teammates. According to Noel's plan, he wanted to have at least one more teammate. Otherwise, with just him and Alma going to conquer the abyss, it would be very dangerous. So for now, they would just observe today to make plans for the future. After leaving the assessment guild, the next place Noel wanted to visit was a dwarf couple's forge. Good equipment would increase a seeker's combat power, so they couldn't forget about regular maintenance. After maintenance, the next place Noel took Alma to was a skill book shop. He wanted to buy some scout skill books for Alma. However, each store sold skill books for different professions, so Noel had to go to another shop if he wanted to buy skill books for himself. Before leaving, he had to emphasize to Alma that the maximum budget he was giving her was only 1 million dong, and he specifically reminded Alma not to spend it frivolously. Despite being reminded like that, when they met again, Alma had still bought herself a teddy bear. Noel was about to get angry when Alma held out a book. She had used 800,000 dong to buy an armor-piercing skill for assassins, and with the remaining money, she bought this teddy bear, fitting the budget perfectly without a single dong left over. Alma had good equipment, but Noel wasn't as satisfied. He wanted to buy an undead purification skill, but the price of that skill exceeded his budget, so Noel would temporarily leave it at the shop. Just then, a man walked past Noel. Noel received a signal and immediately excused himself from Alma, saying he had something to do. Noel entered a poor street and met the information dealer Loki. As per Noel's request, he had infiltrated the Imperial prison and brought back all the information about the death row inmate Hugo. After delivering the information, Loki was a bit curious and asked Noel why he would risk inviting such a ruthless murderer into his team. Noel had his own reasons and was sure Hugo was innocent, which is why he wanted his information. After carefully examining the information Loki provided, Noel paid him. Before leaving, Loki had a special offer for a regular customer. Lately, he had learned that a harmful drug was spreading in the area. Though it got you extremely high, in return, it would make the user go berserk. Normally, for such drugs, the Finaccio family wouldn't let the person behind it get away. But this case was different because the person smuggling this drug into the market was the boss of a branch of the same Mafia gang, so nothing could be done. Loki knew who the boss was and specifically warned Noel to be very careful during this time. Meanwhile, Alma was waiting for Noel and was quite upset. They were walking together, and suddenly he just disappeared without knowing where. Noel really didn't understand women's thoughts. Just at that moment, Lisha passed by and encountered Alma. Noel was on his way back, thinking about what Loki had just reported to him about the boss of that Mafia gang. Noel had also heard that the previous boss had suddenly passed away, and his son had recently taken over. It seemed this guy was very tough, so Finaccio didn't dare to touch him. Suddenly, Noel walked past a beggar who looked very ragged, making Noel feel a bit sorry for him. So he deliberately dropped a coin, wanting to give the man a full meal. But this person was too honest and thought Noel had dropped the money accidentally, so he called Noel back to return it. Noel turned back to look at him, flashed a disdainful smile, and refused to take back the dirty money before walking away. The beggar still followed Noel, making him annoyed enough to kick the man in the stomach. At this point, the beggar was also quite angry. Although he didn't want to fight, he wasn't so gentle that he would let Noel bully him easily. He began to assume a fighting stance. This surprised Noel a bit because the man's stance was not that of an amateur. He rushed up to attack Noel, but at this point, Noel was still able to grab his hand and slam him against the wall. After just 2 moves, the man had already determined that Noel was a strong person, so he didn't want to go easy on Noel anymore. He assumed a defensive position and began to gather his strength. Noel's lips couldn't stop curling up. This time he had struck gold. If the man met his expectations, he would recruit him into his team. Noel also drew his knife, ready to fight, when at that moment, a dwarf appeared and continuously scolded the beggar. Meanwhile, Lisha was sitting listening to Alma's complaints. After knowing everything, Lisha also thought that the reason Noel left at this time was because he was looking for a new teammate, probably trying to find someone suitable so that Alma could freely choose to level up her profession. The dwarf man scolded the beggar, and even though he tried to apologize, the man didn't care. He used the ring on his hand to emit an electric current that caused the beggar to pass out immediately from pain. Just by looking, Noel knew immediately that this was a slave ring, and it seemed this guy was the owner of the beggar. After dealing with the beggar, the dwarf turned his attention to Noel. He even mistook Noel for a girl and had perverted intentions toward him. Of course, he would get a beating from Noel. Noel bent down and pressed a gun against his throat, threatening him to confess everything. This guy came from a southern town, from a family that controlled an underground arena. Due to embezzling funds, he had to flee to the imperial capital. Hearing this, Noel understood the man's problem. It seemed that Koga was someone this guy had bought and used to fight in the underground arena, and from there joined an organization in this imperial capital. Only in this way would he no longer be hunted by his old family. Noel put the gun in the guy's mouth and began to calculate. This guy was being hunted, so dying here probably wouldn't be a problem. If he died, then that guy over there would belong to Noel. Meanwhile, after learning that Noel wanted to find another teammate, Alma didn't seem happy at all. For her, Noel only needed one teammate, which was her alone, and as for new people, she would kill anyone who joined. On Noel's side, he had fired a shot but didn't kill the dwarf. Noel wasn't that cruel and gave him 10 seconds to get out of his sight. The dwarf was so scared that he kicked Koga in the stomach to wake him up and go with him. And he really got up and ran after him, which disappointed Noel greatly. If he were a man, Koga could completely kill his cruel master and regain his freedom. What Noel needed was a brave wolf, not a guard dog like him. Afterward, Noel returned, and as soon as Lisha saw him, she reproached him for leaving Alma in the middle of their date. Alma looked at Noel with bullet eyes. Left with no choice, he had to treat the two of them to tea. While drinking, Noel asked Lisha if she knew about the dangerous drug that had been around lately. Looking at Lisha's blank face, it was clear she didn't know. So Noel kindly reminded Lisha to go back and inform Wolf, telling him to be careful during this time. It was the first time Noel had shown concern for another team, which surprised Lisha very much. But she also had an appointment, so she excused herself and left first, promising Alma that next time she would take her to a cafe much better than this place, going as friends, not colleagues. Hearing this, Alma was very happy and immediately accepted Lisha as her close friend. Lisha turned to look at Noel. Of course, he was still cold and unwilling to accept. Watching Lisha leave, Noel began to think about that drug again. It was being spread, but very few people knew about it. He just hoped that this drug wouldn't cause big trouble for him. Meanwhile, the dwarf had taken Koga to a Mafia gang to ask for help. Of all people, he went to the boss of the Gambino gang, a genuine madman. The dwarf's wanted poster was plastered all over the imperial capital, and this Albert had no intention of helping him. There was no reason for Albert to dirty his hands with a rustic Mafia gang. However, to make it more fun, he decided to turn the dwarf and Koga into stuffed animals. Hearing this, the dwarf was sweating profusely, thinking Albert was just threatening him. Of course not. He flashed an evil smile at the dwarf. Koga looked at his master, scared pale, but could only kneel silently in one place. At this moment, he remembered scenes from the past. Even though he had fled to a distant country, his fate here and at his old place wasn't any different, so he just had to accept his fate. Just as Albert ordered his subordinates to get to work, someone came in to announce that the village chief of Mint, who was late in paying them, had arrived. As soon as the village chief saw Albert, he began to blame everything on Noel. Then he flattered Albert, saying that Noel had spoken ill of his Mafia family. The purpose was to make Albert shift all his attention to Noel, helping him get revenge and postponing the debt collection. But Albert didn't care about that at all. No matter what was said, the fact that he was late with the money remained the truth, and Albert would never forgive someone who broke a promise. If Noel had taken his right eye, then he would take his right arm. Then he turned to call Koga. From the beginning, he knew Koga's profession was a blade swordsman. He ordered Koga to cut off the village chief's hand with his wooden staff. The dwarf continuously urged Koga to get to work. With no choice, he stood up and prepared to do it. But Albert stopped him for a moment. He bit a pill and entered a high state. For him, when watching violent scenes, he had to be a bit high for it to be fun. The village chief still didn't believe Koga could cut off his hand with a wooden staff. But in just 1 second, his arm had fallen off, not even giving his brain time to feel the pain. It wasn't until the blood began to seep out that the village chief clutched his arm, screaming in agony. Albert laughed maniacally. Taking this opportunity, the dwarf praised Koga to Albert. Koga's strength had always been formidable. Since being bought as a slave, he had always been the champion in the underground arena, and if Albert liked, he was willing to give Koga to him. After that display, Koga was definitely a bargain, and there was no way Albert would refuse this bargain. So from now on, Koga had been transferred to a new master. Albert's disciple took him away to change clothes. As he changed, Koga recalled his past. From birth, he had been someone no one needed. His father was a wealthy merchant, and his mother was a beautiful woman. A family that lacked nothing except a child. And during a visit to a temple to pray, Koga's mother was raped by mountain bandits. No one knew whose child Koga was. After that incident, his father no longer trusted her at all and didn't accept Koga as his son. This was his mother's trauma, and when she saw the man she loved reject her, she slit her throat and committed suicide, leaving Koga all alone. He had tried to live in that family, tried to please his father, but no matter what he did, the man still couldn't accept Koga as his son. One beautiful morning when Koga woke up, he found himself on a ship. It didn't take long for Koga to realize he had been sold as a slave. Koga's first master was that dwarf. He put Koga in the underground arena to fight. There, Koga had demonstrated his skills and won every victory. When praised by the man, Koga had burst into tears because it was the first time anyone had acknowledged him. But in the end, Koga also realized that a slave was still just a slave. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't change that. That night, Noel received information from Loki and immediately went to an abandoned church. Because Noel was a regular customer, Loki specially called him out to give him a secret piece of information. The Gambino family was targeting his life. At that moment, Noel heard a strange noise. He immediately discovered that Loki had betrayed him. Noel pulled out his gun and pointed it at Loki's face, asking why he had done this. Loki was out of options. He had been forced by the Gambino family to do this, and he raised his hands in surrender, allowing Noel to deal with him as he wished, because Loki himself felt guilty for daring to betray the trust of an information buyer. Noel gritted his teeth but couldn't bring himself to shoot, only telling Loki to leave. This time he would let Loki off, and also reminded him that from now on, he didn't need to fear the Gambino family's revenge anymore, because Noel himself would wipe out this family. From the shadows, Koga stepped out, astonished that the person who had given him money earlier was now the target. Koga had to be honest with Noel that he didn't want to fight at all. But he couldn't disobey his master's orders. Koga took a breath and shouted loudly, revealing all his skills and profession to Noel. This made Noel immediately realize that he wanted a fair fight. If that was the case, then Noel would go all the way too. He also revealed all his skills to Koga. The battle began. In the blink of an eye, Koga had dodged all of Noel's bullets and closed in. Noel had to use a grappling hook to fly up to the ceiling to avoid the attack. The man's speed was astonishingly fast, making Noel a bit cautious. At this point, Noel fired a fire bullet down at Koga. People with frontline professions all had fire resistance, but this fire of Noel's wasn't normal. Moreover, at such close range, Noel was quite sure Koga couldn't defend against it. At that moment, Koga sliced through Noel's flame, startling him. He couldn't cut fire, but he could cut the air to extinguish Noel's flame. The two rushed up to the roof to fight. This was a life or death battle, so Noel would use all his abilities to win. From his pocket, Noel pulled out a flash bomb and threw it at Koga's face. He was blinded, creating an opportunity for Noel to attack. But somehow, sword energies appeared in mid-air. Fortunately, Noel detected them in time and was able to back away to avoid the attack. But after this move, dust and smoke were everywhere, obscuring Noel's vision. As for Koga, even though his eyes were still affected by the flash bomb, he could still sense Noel's position and rushed to attack. The place where Noel stood had taken too much damage and began to collapse. Noel fell, creating a golden opportunity for Koga to attack. At this moment, Noel used his roaring skill, wanting to paralyze Koga. Somehow, Koga could still move, despite being hit directly by his skill. When Noel opened his eyes once more, he saw Koga's sword pointed directly at his face. This confused Noel greatly since Koga hadn't finished him off immediately. Noel was certain Koga's mission was to eliminate him. Hearing Noel's question, Koga tried to explain. Of course, he had to complete his mission, but something inside him was hesitating. At that, Noel grabbed Koga's blade firmly. Koga turned pale with worry and hurriedly asked Noel to let go. Noel became angry and shouted directly in his face not to be merciful to enemies. If Koga didn't kill him now, the entire Gambino family would hunt Koga to death. In this world, one's own life was the most important thing. Couldn't Koga understand even that? Despite such clear reasoning, Koga still didn't understand. He couldn't bring himself to strike Noel. Time for games was over. Noel released his weapon, and at that moment, darts struck the ground where Koga was standing. It was Alma. She had come to the rescue. Alma smiled and reminded Koga that only she was allowed to pin Noel to the ground. At this point, Noel clutched his wound and collapsed. From the very beginning of the fight, he had used his communication skill to call for help from Alma, and fortunately, she had arrived in time. Alma turned to ask Noel if she could kill Koga. Noel's answer was yes, and with that, Alma flashed an evil smile and rushed to attack Koga. Koga broke out in a sweat, just blocking the blow and advising Alma to stop. His sword would never cut a woman. This irritated Alma a bit, as Koga kept thinking he was better than her. So Alma used her skill to increase her speed, moving around Koga to find a blind spot. Yet somehow, Koga just closed his eyes, and all of Alma's attacks and hidden weapons were deflected. Seeing this scene, Noel realized something. There would always be someone stronger. That skill of Koga's was clear water. Closing his eyes would significantly enhance all his senses. No wonder the flash grenade hadn't worked earlier. Noel's lips curled into a smile. He wouldn't hesitate anymore. After exchanging a few moves, Alma finally acknowledged that Koga was very strong. Being this strong, she would have to kill him. Koga also felt the same way. After advising repeatedly with no effect, he would have to act. Just as both were preparing to deliver a killing blow, a flare was shot into the sky. It was Noel, ordering Alma to retreat immediately. This flare would bring the city guards here soon. As for Koga, before leaving, Noel had a message for him to deliver to Albert. Because Koga had failed his mission, he would be punished. However, Albert was too insane. The one who had made the mistake was Koga, but he punished the dwarf, Koga's former master. He gave the dwarf's head to Koga and reminded him this was the first and last time. If Koga failed again, he would certainly die. Afterward, Koga also relayed what Noel had asked of him. Noel was someone who would always repay debts, and his revenge would be terrible. Noel affirmed he would crush the Gambino family. After hearing these things, Albert went crazy. He immediately ordered his disciple Rios to gather the combat team to hunt down Noel at once. Koga carried the dwarf's head out of the room, and Rios reproached him for saying unnecessary things. Koga knew this and apologized profusely to Rios, then told him what Noel was capable of. Koga admitted he was a strong person. Even though he was a talksmith, he could still fight fairly with Koga. Of course, in the end, he still couldn't defeat someone with a combat profession. But that craziness and determination made Koga greatly respect Noel. Hearing this, Rios just smiled and patted Koga's shoulder. It seemed Koga had already come to admire Noel's abilities and, sooner or later, would want to follow him. A while later, Albert had brought his men to the tavern to meet Noel. As soon as they met, he started criticizing Noel for being filthy. Noel was no less aggressive, insulting him back. This guy couldn't tolerate it and immediately drew his knife, wanting to slash Noel's face, when a big seeker stopped him. He didn't care what grudge Albert had with Noel, but this tavern was reserved exclusively for seekers. Fighting was forbidden inside, and if he persisted, regardless of who he was, he would be beaten. Albert became furious and ordered his men to kill the big man, but Rios bent down and whispered in Albert's ear, reminding him that killing people in this tavern would be easy. But how would Albert explain it to the Godfather afterward? Moreover, they were being monitored for selling banned drugs. If they killed all the seekers here now, they would certainly die. However, Albert's orders were absolute. If he still insisted on killing, Rios would still follow. After hearing these things, Albert began to hesitate, and Noel laughed loudly, thinking he was so fierce, but in the end, he didn't dare confront the Godfather and the Empire. Then Noel pointed to the wine bottle on the table. Just now, when Albert arrived, he had taken a sip of wine, and it seemed this was enough for him to be poisoned. Albert was scared, his eyes wide, not believing it, but looking into Noel's eyes, he fell to his knees and stuck his fingers in his throat, trying to vomit, and was hurriedly taken outside by his men to find a doctor. After Albert left, Rios smiled and complimented Noel. He picked up the wine bottle on the table and drank it all in one go. He had known all along there was no poison in it, but Noel's calmness had frightened Albert into running away. It was truly admirable, just as Koga had said. Rios placed a few coins on the table to pay for Noel's wine. Just this once, he would spare him and demanded that Noel leave the imperial capital immediately. Refusal meant immediate death. Noel stared at him and agreed. He led Alma out of the tavern. After leaving the imperial capital's gate, Alma laughed loudly, praising Noel. Everything had happened exactly as Noel had predicted. For Noel, this was just the beginning. For now, they would leave the imperial capital and return after a week. There were some things Noel needed to investigate. Exactly 1 week later, Noel and Alma returned, and Albert came out to meet him. At this point, he was very angry and ordered his men to capture Noel. But after waiting, no one would act. Noel burst into loud laughter. There was only one reason why the subordinates wouldn't obey his orders. He had lost his position as the leader of the Gambino gang. Everything had happened earlier that afternoon. Rios and his men had a private meeting without informing Albert. Rios's men were very tired of this. They had joined this world out of admiration for the will of the previous leader, not for the crazy Albert. At this moment, Noel appeared from behind them. He had left as Rios had requested, but now he returned because he had a gift for him. From Loki, Noel had obtained Albert's birth certificate, and he was not at all the son of the previous leader. Loki confirmed that the previous boss knew he wasn't his son, but perhaps due to still having feelings for Albert's mother, he had accepted him. After passing on this information, Loki was about to leave when Noel stopped him. He still wanted Loki to investigate one more thing, the death of the previous boss. Noel suspected that Albert had poisoned and killed him. Returning to the present, Noel's predictions had been completely accurate. That bastard Albert had conspired with the boss's doctor to kill him. The evidence was clear. Rios was furious, bending down to grab Albert's collar and lift him up, wanting to kill him with one move. But he was still the one whom the previous boss had named as his successor, and Rios couldn't ignore that. So Rios decided to give Albert one last chance to prove his leadership abilities. Rios pointed towards Noel and Alma. Albert was allowed to choose one of the people here to fight against those two. If Albert won, they would acknowledge him as a boss. As soon as he finished speaking, Finaccio appeared. His appearance made Albert turn pale with fear. Why was Finaccio here? He flashed a big smile, mocking him. Of course, it was to witness the duel with Noel. Finaccio was here because Noel had invited him. For Finaccio, who had always been waiting for an opportunity to crush the Gambino family, this opportunity that Noel gave him was truly wonderful. On Albert's side, he still didn't want to participate in the decisive battle. There was no reason for him to act like that. Finaccio angrily grabbed his face and shouted loudly that as a boss, he had only brought disgrace to the gang. This would be his last chance. If he complained anymore, he would certainly die. Being threatened directly made Albert afraid. He tremblingly asked what would happen if he won. As Rios had explained before, if he won, he would continue to be the boss. Moreover, Finaccio promised to speak for him before the Godfather, so he would no longer be pursued for the issue of selling fake drugs. Albert looked around and chose Koga to fight, exactly as Noel had predicted, simply because Koga was bound by a slave contract and was the only one at this time who couldn't betray Albert. Alma smiled. If so, she could kill him now. Noel patted Alma's shoulder and pushed her back. He would face Koga in this battle. This was already the third time Noel had confronted Koga. Koga looked at Noel and broke out in a sweat, as Noel always revealed an extremely confident gaze, as if he had already secured victory. However, this made Koga very happy. He knew Noel had prepared a strategy. Let's see how Noel would fight him. Just waiting for Finaccio's signal, the two rushed into battle. Noel immediately fired an ice bullet, freezing the entire battle area. Albert watched with a smirk on his face. He was very confident he would win this match because, after all, Noel was a talksmith. How could he possibly defeat someone with a combat profession like Koga? Inside the ice ring, Koga and Noel exchanged moves continuously. At this point, Koga sheathed his sword, startling Noel. He immediately recognized that he was preparing to use the first flash technique, maximizing the speed of drawing his sword. If Noel entered Koga's attack range, he would die instantly. If he knew in advance, then it wasn't scary. Noel himself had also prepared his plan. Noel threw away his gun and revealed to Koga that his gun was out of bullets, so he would end the fight with the next move. Noel drew his sword and charged forward. Koga was very cautious. He knew for sure Noel had some plan ready and didn't act rashly. As soon as Noel entered his attack range, Koga swung a fatal sword strike. Somehow, Noel was too crazy, using his right hand to block Koga's attack, then knocking Koga's sword away. Koga was startled, hurriedly kicking Noel in the stomach and running to retrieve his sword. Then came a series of attacks that broke the ice arena. Noel was knocked outside, and Koga took advantage to pursue him, delivering a straight cut to Noel's chest. Although he had struck accurately, at this moment, Koga felt something was wrong. As expected, Noel had thrown a magazine in front of Koga. At this close range, Koga couldn't dodge anymore. The magazine exploded, beginning to freeze Koga's body. Just waiting for this, Noel rushed up and delivered a finishing kick. Koga was hit, coughing up blood and collapsing to the ground. In this moment, he remembered his painful past. From birth, he had been weak, never daring to oppose anyone, until he received the sword slave profession. Koga had fought frantically, improving his skills, but in the end, was still a weak person who only followed others' orders. Noel was different. Although he was a talksmith, he always fought with confidence. The battle was over. Noel and Alma left immediately. This time, Rios's group owed Noel a favor, but Noel didn't care and didn't need them to repay him. This very thing made Rios understand why Koga admired Noel so much. Noel was taken by Alma to a room to bandage his wounds. She was angry, scolding Noel for not fulfilling his responsibility. Clearly, she was the one who needed to fight. Noel was the commander. Why did he keep taking her job? Arguing with a woman was troublesome, so Noel apologized quickly. Just then, Finocchio came in wanting to talk privately with Noel. He didn't want to beat around the bush and went straight to the main issue. Finocchio invited Noel to join his Mafia gang. If he did, Noel could immediately become the boss of the Gambino gang. The conditions were very favorable, but Noel still refused. He didn't want to work under anyone. Finocchio smiled and raised his hand, revealing to Noel what his profession was. Noel then realized that his heart had been in Finoccio's hand for who knows how long. This was a skill belonging to the scout group. The activation condition was when the opponent refused Finocchio twice, and Noel had just met that condition. At this point, Finocchio didn't want to play with Noel anymore. After witnessing everything, he was certain that, if not now, then in the future, Noel would definitely be a threat to his family, so he had to eliminate Noel while he was still in the egg. Once more, Finocchio had to ask Noel if he would agree to be a member of his family, refuse and die. Despite being threatened like this, Noel wasn't afraid at all. Instead, he walked straight up to Finocchio and threatened him back. If possible, do it here and now. A person from a notorious Mafia gang doing cowardly things like killing the weak. The moment Finocchio struck, Noel also declared that his family would fall into decline. Noel spread his arms and declared that in this world, the only one above him was himself. One day, he would definitely become the strongest seeker in the world. Noel's determination and resolute attitude made Finocchio a bit cautious. In the end, he withdrew his skill. Before leaving, he still had to remind Noel once more. He would remember what Noel had just declared. If one day Noel forgot it, Finocchio himself would come to hold him accountable. Finocchio and his men returned to the carriage. Albert was still waiting here for the verdict. At this point, he became afraid and begged Finocchio to save him. He agreed immediately, but would give Albert a new life, living with the pigs at his house. With those words, Albert was dragged away by Finoccio's men. The next morning, Koga brought the ring and slave certificate to Noel. From now on, Noel would be his new master. Noel sighed deeply and refused. Noel let Koga know his goal was to become the strongest seeker in this empire. To do that, he needed a brave wolf, not a dog that always had to look at its master's face to act. Noel returned the slave certificate to Koga, declaring that from now on, Koga was free. Koga smiled and bowed his head. How ironic that he had always wished for freedom, and now that the wish had come true, he didn't know what to do. So with determination, Koga asked Noel to join his team. If Noel needed a brave wolf, then Koga swore by all his remaining dignity that he would fight alongside him to the end. And so Noel's team welcomed a new member. The training of the three began right after. Each person had their own position. With Koga on the team, breaking through the enemy's front line was much easier. Even if they defended, with Alma's armor-breaking skill to assist, Koga could still easily penetrate through their defensive line. At that moment, Noel used his roaring skill, forcing all the monsters to be paralyzed, then gave Koga the opportunity to finish off the monster leader. After the battle, Koga and Alma argued again. As Alma kept taking Koga's tasks, Noel stepped forward to remind the two of them to adjust their formation. There were a few things he needed to convey after this battle. With Koga's contribution, Noel was confident enough to establish a clan. Seeing that Koga and Alma didn't understand what a clan was, Noel had to explain it to them once more. At this point, Koga noticed a symbol on Noel's hand. Alma immediately recognized it as the promotion symbol. Noel had enough strength and level to rank up from Class C to Class B. For Noel, this would be a big step forward. As planned, in the next year, Noel would, at all costs, lead his clan to enter the ranks of the 7-star clans of the Atrai Empire. The next day, Noel's vineyard had an unexpected visitor. Before meeting that person, Noel had ordered his servants to bribe this visitor a little, as it would make conversation easier. An old man appeared right behind Noel, introducing himself as Harold, the supervisor of Seekers. Noel quickly invited him into the room to talk. He poured Harold a glass of wine produced right there. Taking a sip, Harold had to compliment Noel. Even though Noel had just taken responsibility for this production facility, he already had the talent to direct the servants to work very well. Noel just smiled in response, then wondered about Harold's appearance here. Clearly, he had already testified about everything that had happened in his hometown. From his pocket, Harold pulled out a photo. This was a picture of a king-level monster that had appeared a few days ago. Just by looking, Noel immediately recognized it as the monster that had attacked his hometown, and he knew it was still alive. Because after that terrifying battle that night, two things had disappeared from the scene. First, the body of that monster, and second, his grandfather's battle axe. Harold became serious, informing Noel that just a few days ago, this monster had attacked another town. The leading guild, Nightag, had accepted the mission to eliminate it, but had failed miserably. When another guild came to help, the monster had fled the scene, returning to the abyss. Normally, once monsters appear, they don't run away, but this one seemed to have its own consciousness. This made Harold speculate that it hadn't just reached the king level, but had already reached the valiant level. A bit more information about the abyss. There are a total of 13 levels, ruled by 10 great kings. Each of them has more than enough power to destroy this world. According to history, the last recorded sighting of a valiant was 40 years ago. In the blink of an eye, it had destroyed 3 kingdoms, and then was eliminated by Noel's grandfather's team. The fact that Noel's grandfather could drive it back to the abyss was truly a miracle for humanity. However, this time was different. A monster that even over death couldn't do anything about. Harold was very worried it would become a major threat to humanity. Hearing this, Noel inadvertently smiled, startling Harold. He exclaimed that indeed, Noel's eyes were exactly like his grandfather's. This time, he had only come to check on Noel's situation, but perhaps he had worried unnecessarily. The next day, Noel took Alma and Koga to Harold's office for a clan establishment interview. Sitting in the waiting room, Koga was very nervous. This was his first interview. If he said something wrong, Noel's dream would be ruined. Alma just sat beside him, teasing him. These two were so noisy that Noel was extremely uncomfortable. A while later, Harold appeared and began interviewing them. Everything necessary to establish a clan, Noel had prepared fully, but Harold still had to reject this proposal. He was also straightforward in sharing with them that currently, the imperial capital had new regulations. They needed people who were truly strong to establish clans, not just those who barely met the conditions, like Noel's group. Noel wanted to hear more, so Harold reminded them that what he was about to share was a state secret, hoping they wouldn't breathe a word of it outside. It was about a western region of the kingdom. They had discovered a massive mana flow there, flowing rapidly deep underground, and in just one more year, at that place, a valiant level disaster could potentially appear. Koga heard this and turned pale with fear. They already knew in advance. Couldn't they find a way to prevent it? Harold's answer was no. Mana flows underground like blood vessels in the human body. Just a slight impact would cause it to explode. Alma spoke up at this point, asking if they couldn't prevent it. Did they have a chance to win? In the past, Harold had witnessed with his own eyes the battle of over death against the valiant. Thanks to his achievements, the imperial capital had prospered until today. When the next valiant appears, all the regalia guilds will have to participate in the battle. This will be a full-force battle, and even so, he couldn't affirm they would win. That's why the imperial capital currently needs a great source of power, not having time to nurture newcomers like Noel's group. Hearing this, Noel understood. Harold's words were very reasonable. He would withdraw his application to create a clan, but only temporarily. On the way back, Koga kept asking Noel if he really intended to give up so easily. This was clearly his dream. Of course, Noel had no such intention. On the contrary, the appearance of the valiant was his opportunity. Noel pulled the other two into an alley to enlighten them. In reality, a valiant-level monster is a disaster for humanity. But the fact that his grandfather could eliminate it is what allowed the imperial capital to develop until today. The device created from the heart of that valiant provides energy for the entire imperial capital. New inventions in this place are also created from powerful monsters. That's why the imperial capital encourages people to become seekers, turning disaster into a blessing from heaven. That's what seekers truly are. In 1 year, the disastrous valiant monster will appear. so Noel needed to adjust his plan a bit. Previously, he had planned to use the next year to become a regalia guild, but now he would reduce his target time. Noel divided it into 2 phases. The first 6 months would focus on consolidating the team's strength to meet the criteria for establishing a clan, and the remaining 6 months would find a way to join regalia. By then, his team would be able to participate in the battle against that valiant disaster. To join regalia as quickly as possible, they needed an achievement that would shake the entire imperial capital, an achievement that everyone would know about. The next day, Noel went to upgrade his profession. From a talksmith, he upgraded to becoming a strategist, a sub-branch of his profession, helping Noel analyze situations in real time without having to plan in advance. As soon as he walked out of the assessment guild, Noel encountered Sieg, the deputy leader of the Black Dragon team. He was surrounded by countless girls praising his recent achievements. Seeing Noel, Sieg immediately ran over to greet him. In this imperial capital, there were 3 seekers who had reached the X level. First was the leader of the 100 Demons Night Walker, Rio. Next was the leader of the Mighty Dragon team, Victor. And finally, Sieg, the deputy leader of the Mighty Dragon team. He didn't beat around the bush and went straight to the point. After hearing about Noel's achievement of defeating the Gambino gang, Sieg was very interested in Noel and wanted to invite him to join his Mighty Dragon team. Without needing to hear more, Noel directly refused. Sieg grabbed the hilt of his sword and threatened Noel. Seeing this, Noel remained very calm and provocatively taunted him. He didn't want to serve under anyone, but if it was mandatory, he would serve the strongest person. There were 3 strongest seekers in the imperial capital. Victor was already old, so only Rio and Sieg were on par with each other. If Sieg wanted him to serve him, he had to prove he was the stronger one. With those words, Noel immediately left. Just then, 2 seeker guys recognized Sieg. They called Sieg the 2nd strongest person in the imperial capital, which made Sieg very hot-blooded, because he and Rio had never actually had a duel, but somehow everyone thought Rio was superior to him. Noel pretended to leave but actually hid in a corner, hearing everything. Now he had grasped the weakness of this Sieg. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, Alma and Lisha were having a practice duel. After several matches, Lisha was still the victor. She advised Alma that she really wasn't suited for the front line at all. At this moment, another girl came to greet Alma. It was Ophelia, a sister from the same hometown as Lisha. Conveniently, Lisha also introduced Alma to her. Ophelia didn't come alone. She also brought her team along. Seeing Lisha so enthusiastic, she also introduced them to Alma. Her team had only 4 people, but each was very strong and reliable. Then Ophelia turned to remind Lisha to be careful with the seeker named Noel. She had heard Noel was a very scary person, selling his own teammates as slaves and associating with Mafia. Ophelia kept bad-mouthing him without knowing that Alma was Noel's teammate. At this point, Leon, the team leader, spoke up to stop Ophelia. He didn't like Ophelia judging people by their appearance like that. After all, they hadn't met Noel yet, so there was no need to condemn him like that. After their group left, Lisha turned to apologize to Alma. Alma wasn't upset because everything Sister Ophelia said was true. That night, Noel again met with Loki to get information. This time, Noel needed a complete list of all Class B seekers in the city. Noel's attention was directed solely at Leon and his team. The achievements and abilities of this team made them considered the top Class B team in the Empire. So Noel had a new goal for himself. Everyone has weaknesses, and when those weaknesses are exposed, smiles fade and cracks gradually form. Noel revealed a sinister smile, making Loki a bit worried. It seemed Noel was preparing to implement some crazy plan again. In the Imperial prison, the puppet knight Hugo was sitting curled up silently in his room when a prison guard came to call him out. Someone needed to see Hugo. It was Noel. Seeing Noel, Hugo didn't seem surprised because Noel had been there many times. Noel had already expressed his purpose to Hugo. Because he was controlled by the killing demon inside him, he had committed many terrible acts and was currently in prison awaiting execution. Noel didn't want Hugo to die at all. On the contrary, he wanted to rescue Hugo from here and have him become his teammate. The reason Noel went to such lengths was that Hugo had a very rare profession. As a production type, Hugo could control numerous puppet soldier states. Moreover, he was a seeker considered a genius. His adaptability and strength were all perfect, but because of these strengths, Hugo had always been a lone wolf without teammates. Tired of this way of life, Hugo had abandoned his seeker identity and switched to living as a puppet artist. Although he still achieved success in life, who knows what lies ahead. Returning to the present, Hugo still adamantly refused Noel's offer. Noel just smiled and snapped his fingers, and immediately, the prison guard, obedient as a dog, brought tea to Noel. He hadn't threatened him, but just knew his weakness. In front of Hugo, Noel affirmed that all the guards in this prison were under his control, and Noel was planning step by step to release Hugo. Saying this, Noel stood up and reminded Hugo once more. People called him a venomous snake who would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. This time was no different. Noel firmly stated that he would definitely rescue Hugo from this prison and make him his teammate. That evening, Noel took everyone to a new tavern. This tavern was exclusively for Class B seekers and above, so Koga was a bit worried, but Noel confidently walked in. Immediately, a big guy appeared wanting to bully Noel, but there was no way Noel would let him have his way. He had already reviewed all the information of the rank B seekers in this imperial capital. Even their secrets were in the palm of his hand. Edgar, this guy, was about to have a child, so Noel used it as an excuse to threaten him back. If he wanted to play the game of big fish eating small fish with him, that was fine, but he hoped he would be prepared to face the consequences. Being held by his weakness, Edgar became too afraid to do anything more. Afterward, they all sat eating delicious dishes in the tavern. Koga praised endlessly, but Noel remained very focused because this time, he came here with a different purpose. Just as he thought about it, his target appeared. Noel aimed directly at Leon's group. Of course, Ophelia also appeared with them. Having met Alma once before, Ophelia quickly recognized her and ran over to greet her. Noel used his communication skill to ask Alma and then learned some interesting information. Alma gently reminded Noel that Ophelia didn't have good thoughts about him, so Noel needed to be careful. But Noel didn't care. Not having good thoughts about him was even better because this time, Noel's purpose was to cause trouble. When Ophelia asked about the two people sitting beside her, Alma, following Noel's order, introduced them to her right away. Just hearing the name Noel once, she began spewing contemptuous words, unable to believe that Noel dared to sell his teammates to the Mafia. Noel also taunted her back, making Ophelia angry and wanting to hit him. Koga appeared to stop her. No matter what, Noel was still the leader of the group, so Ophelia couldn't just do whatever she wanted. At this moment, Leon appeared. Seeing Ophelia causing trouble, he immediately bowed his head to apologize to Noel. Noel just smiled and reminded Leon that as the owner of a group, he should control his dog better to prevent it from biting people indiscriminately. This truly touched Leon's self-respect. He asked Noel to take back what he had just said. Even though Ophelia had acted inappropriately towards Noel, he shouldn't scold her so harshly. Ophelia, taking advantage, began to pump Leon up, letting him know that the person sitting there was Noel, and all the rumors about him were entirely true. So Leon didn't bother holding back with Noel anymore and scolded him back. Not respecting teammates, his mouth always looking down on others, Noel wasn't worthy of being a seeker, and if Noel continued to act like this, there would inevitably come a day when he would face retribution. Noel immediately retorted, "What about Leon?" Listening to outsiders pump him up, always thinking he was right and the center of everything. He would also face consequences one day. Noel's verbal sparring was far superior, making Leon angrily leave immediately. At this point, Koga felt that Noel had been a bit too harsh with them, so Noel revealed his plan to Koga and Alma. After hearing it, they shouted out loud at how dirty Noel was playing. Noel didn't think so. In this seeker world, there are hunters and the hunted, but the strong don't always have the right to hunt. Noel flashed an evil smile. He would target Leon's team, using him as a stepping stone to reach the top. Meanwhile, Harold was receiving Marion. Sitting in his room, Marion had her legs crossed, prompting Harold to remind her. Then they discussed who would command the operation against the valiant monster. Marion nominated Rio, while Harold nominated Noel. As soon as she heard this, Marion burst into laughter. Clearly, he had rejected the boys' clan establishment application. And now what was he nominating him for? So Marion and Harold, grandfather and granddaughter, had a bet with each other. If Marion won, Harold would surrender the position of family head to her. If he won, Marion would have to learn the proper etiquette of a woman. Kaim, a member of Leon's group, was wandering on a night road in the imperial capital. As he walked, he recalled his childhood days with Leon. Even then, Leon was a righteous person. Although he had a combat profession, Leon never wanted to use violence against violence. Seeing Leon's pure eyes, Kaim immediately invited him to become a seeker. They couldn't always hide in this poor village. They had to become strong seekers, drive away monsters, help people, and live a truly righteous life. With his powerful profession, when they grew up, Kaim and Leon established a team and quickly achieved desirable accomplishment. The original name of the team was Twilight, agreed upon by all 4 members of the team. But somehow, over time, people began to call their team Celestial Wings, after Leon's skill. The fact that people remembered Leon this way made Kaim affirm that Leon would definitely achieve something truly great. Returning to the present, Kaim and Leon were sitting in a tavern. The fact that Leon had suddenly become angry earlier made him feel that this was the first time he couldn't control his emotions like that. Kaim immediately patted Leon's shoulder to encourage him, then held out a letter. This was a letter from the Seeker Association reminding teams with real strength to quickly establish clans. Regarding this letter, Leon and all members of the team had received it. They had been delaying the establishment of a clan for a long time, so it was time to decide to take another step forward. Of course, all teammates would follow Leon's wishes. The very next morning, Kaim and Leon went to see Harold to request establishing a guild. Harold immediately refused and told them about the Valiant event coming in a year. As for the letter they had received, he hadn't sent it. This made Kaim very upset. Who would play such a prank on them? The interview had ended. Harold sent Kaim and Leon away, but Leon didn't want to give up so easily. He bowed his head, begging the man to give them a chance. Harold sighed deeply and accepted the proposal. He wanted to assign Leon's team a mission. They would have to eliminate a level 8 monster as designated by the association. Kaim patted Leon's shoulder, agreeing immediately. Even though this monster was above their level, sooner or later, if they wanted to advance, they would have to confront it anyway. Participating in this test wasn't just Leon's team alone. There was another team that had been rejected from establishing a clan a few days ago, and its leader had begged just like Leon was doing now. So the association had decided to organize this test. Whichever team eliminated the monster would be allowed to establish a clan immediately. With those words, Harold called Noel to enter. Noel just smiled, greeting Kaim and Leon, while Leon's eyes widened in surprise as he looked at him. The monster in their extermination mission this time was called Dantalion. Harold asked everyone once more if they knew what kind of monster it was. Noel understood this monster very well. It had the ability to read human minds through a third eye. Its appearance resembled a monkey, with a deceitful and cruel nature. In the past, many seekers who failed to exterminate it were tortured to death by it. After explaining this much, it should be enough. Noel wanted to confirm a few mandatory conditions for the test. In front of Harold, he recounted the incident a few days ago, when he was almost assaulted by a member of Ophelia's group. So Noel wanted to ask Harold to add a condition. It was forbidden to obstruct other teams before the test, and when the test began, they must have all their members. This condition wasn't too much, so Harold agreed immediately. However, since this was a special case where the Imperial capital made an exception for 2 teams, if either side failed, they would face a punishment. They would have to disband their team immediately. Noel didn't hesitate and signed the contract right away. Leon and Kaim were a bit hesitant, but eventually agreed. The test would begin at noon 3 days later. Before leaving, Leon wanted to make peace with Noel. On behalf of Ophelia, Leon apologized to Noel once more. And regarding that test, Leon was very confident in his team's abilities. They were certainly stronger than Noel's team, but after interacting with Noel, Leon realized that Noel had an ability to change common sense, so he wouldn't go easy on Noel in this test. Noel also cheerfully shook hands to reconcile with Leon, then let him know that he had just upgraded his profession to strategist. His calculation ability was almost at the level of prophecy. Noel flashed an evil smile and revealed to Leon that he had already seen the scene of Leon crying and begging before him. 3 days later, both teams gathered to begin the test. At Harold's signal, Leon's group immediately got to work, while Noel's group calmly laid out mats to have lunch. This made Leon very curious and asked Noel. Noel just calmly replied to him that when hungry, one must eat. Haste makes waste. Speaking so vaguely made Leon very angry. Kaim stopped Leon, gently reminding him that from the moment they had to participate in a test with a team like Noel's, their reputation had already hit rock bottom, so they must win this test. They couldn't let Noel remain smug like this. Afterward, Leon's entire team left, regardless of what Noel wanted to do. Entering the abyss, Ophelia quickly used her skill. The enemy's vanguard had discovered their intrusion. She estimated that in just 5 minutes, they would rush here. Wolf knew this wasn't the appropriate time. but he still had to remind everyone about this matter. Yesterday, Noel had come to see him and asked him to betray Leon. As soon as he mentioned this, Ophelia chimed in. She had also received the same request from Noel. Kaim too, but of course, none of them had agreed. Only Leon hadn't been visited by Noel personally. The more Leon thought about it, the more confused he felt. Kaim patted his shoulder to encourage him, assuring that they would never betray Leon, which made him feel a bit more at ease. Just as he finished speaking, the vanguard monsters appeared. Leon quickly used his skill to create a shield to protect everyone. Meanwhile, Noel was still leisurely enjoying lunch. 3 days ago, when Leon and Kaim had left, Harold had a private conversation with Noel. He agreed to let Noel play dirty with Leon's group, but he hadn't permitted Noel to impersonate the association by sending invitation letters to them. Normally, Noel would have been punished immediately, but only he and Harold knew about this. So for now, Harold would turn a blind eye to it. Once again, Harold had to ask Noel if he could achieve victory. Noel still calmly and firmly replied that he would win anyway. Returning to the present, Koga was eating while worrying. What if Leon's group won right away? Noel was certain they couldn't win that quickly. Leon's team was a powerful team, much stronger than their team, so if they wanted to win, they needed to wait. Noel had studied Leon very carefully. The magic emanating from him was much more abundant than normal people, allowing his skills to be activated as fast as his thoughts. However, it was precisely that excellence of Leon's that would one day invisibly turn him into an obstacle. Seeing that Alma and Koga still didn't quite understand, Noel didn't bother to explain further. He was just certain that they would win because the seed he had planted had already formed. Sooner or later, the other 3 members of his team would betray Leon. 3 days ago, Noel had gone to meet Kaim at a tavern. Due to the rule about not causing trouble for others that Harold had set, Kaim couldn't drive Noel away. Sitting beside Kaim drinking wine, Noel went straight to the main issue. He asked Kaim to betray Leon. The reward for this betrayal was freedom. Noel was sure Kaim had realized that Leon was born to be a seeker, unlike Kaim and the others. Chasing after Leon's talent was very difficult. Even if they won the test and established a clan, it would still be a distorted clan. Kaim could never catch up to Leon. Hearing this, Kaim burst into loud laughter and stood up to refuse. Everything Noel said was true, but as Leon's sworn brother, Kaim always wanted to support Leon with the best things. How could he betray Leon? Before Kaim was about to leave, Noel gently reminded him to think very carefully about this because if Kaim didn't do so, then Leon would be the one to betray Kaim first. Returning to the battle, it had been an hour since Leon's entire team confronted the monster Dantalion. Although they had killed all the minor creatures beside it, the situation was still one-sided. This monster was too powerful and could also read people's minds, so none of their attacks could hit it. Leon had used all the power of his profession, launching a dangerous attack from a blind spot. Somehow, Dantalion could still dodge it. Just as Leon was about to follow up with another attack, he suddenly discovered it was holding countless stones in its hands. Leon jumped in surprise and shouted for everyone to dodge immediately. Then Dantalion released a barrage of stones from above onto them. Sitting outside the abyss, Koga was very upset, but Noel still hadn't given the order to act. For Noel, only when Leon's group had exhausted all their abilities would he participate in this battle. After Dantalion's attack, the first to fall was Ophelia. She had lost her ability to fight. Leon hurriedly buffed a power shield to block this monster, allowing the others to carry Ophelia and escape. Facing Dantalion, Leon knew he had no chance of victory, but he still tried to launch a smokescreen attack to blind it, then immediately ran into the magic circle that Vlaklov had created to hide. Thanks to Vlaskov's healing magic, Ophelia was better, but she still couldn't fight anymore. At this point, Kaim proposed a plan. He wanted to use himself as bait so that Leon could unleash his finishing skill. Because that skill had too large an area of effect, Kaim wanted to lure it as far away as possible to avoid affecting Ophelia and Vlaklov. Leon thought about it again and again, but still rejected the plan. The monster Dantalion had the ability to read minds. They could hardly deceive it. Leon himself had another plan. He wanted to cooperate with Noel's group to exterminate it together, though doing so would force them to abandon the test. Perhaps they could also avoid having the entire team disbanded. Hearing these words, Kaim immediately became furious and scolded Leon. How could Leon want to cooperate with the enemy like this? It wasn't like Leon at all. Leon had no choice. As a leader, he had the responsibility to ensure everyone's safety. How could he let his teammates venture into danger? Kaim burst into tears and hugged Leon, then stabbed him with a knife, though not in a dangerous spot. Then he revealed all the distress in his heart. As Leon's sworn brother and teammate, Kaim had always tried to catch up to Leon bit by bit. He had always been ready to sacrifice himself for Leon one day, but now it was over. Kaim fell to his knees, begging for freedom. At this moment, Dantalion had jumped right outside the barrier, not because it had discovered Leon's group, but because Noel had also entered the game. Noel smiled, greeted Leon's group briefly, and then got to work. Dantalion jumped to attack Noel. Noel dodged slightly to the side, and Koga rushed out from the bushes to attack it. With just one strike, the monster felt something was wrong. It couldn't keep up with what Noel and Koga were thinking. Everything had been planned by Noel beforehand. By practicing and using the rapid communication skill, Koga could act even before he had time to think, making it impossible for the monster to react in time. While Koga was fighting it, Noel had shot a bullet straight into the monster's chest. Because it couldn't read thoughts, it couldn't dodge. Moreover, the monster began to feel a headache. Noel had upgraded to become a strategist. His calculation ability was much faster than what the monster could read. Furthermore, Noel was dividing into many hypothetical branches. Such a large amount of information overwhelmed the monster. Just waiting for this, Koga immediately cut off one of its arms. Noel continued to stuff more fake information into its head. Dantalion was in so much pain that it screamed and gouged out the third eye on its forehead to stop it from interfering with its fight. And Noel was just waiting for it to do that. He used his communication skill to order Alma. She received the order from outside the abyss area. Alma maximally buffed her speed and rushed straight to the monster. The monster had detected Alma and swung its arm to hit her. At this moment, Alma had activated a skill, causing Dantalion's attack to pass through her body. This was a skill Alma received after leveling up to become an assassin. Once every 24 hours, Alma would transform into a spirit, immune to all physical effects on her body. Just waiting for the monster to lose its stance, Alma stabbed it, creating a hole right in the middle of its chest. It collapsed, and at the same time, the abyss disappeared, ending the test here. At this point, Kaim crawled over to Noel. Since everything was over, Noel didn't hide anything from them anymore. All the actions of Kaim's group had been calculated by him, including impersonating and sending them invitations to establish a clan, or choosing this Dantalion monster, giving Noel's group an advantage over Kaim's group from the start. Kaim angrily grabbed Noel's collar, but he didn't flinch at all because from the beginning, they had wished for freedom. Kaim's entire team was very strong, but the most outstanding person, the one called a genius, was still only Leon. People only remembered him. Noel looked straight at Leon and declared that they hadn't betrayed Leon. Leon was the one who had betrayed them. In the decisive moment, Leon was the one who didn't trust his teammates. Leon gritted his teeth, knowing he was wrong, so he couldn't refute Noel anymore. At this moment, Harold appeared and declared Noel's team as the winner, allowed to establish a clan immediately. As for Leon's side, according to the agreement, they would have to disband their team right away. News about the Celestial Wings Knights disbanding spread widely throughout the Imperial capital. This made even the most veteran Seekers unable to believe it. Lisha went to the city gate to see off her sister Ophelia. She hugged Lisha tightly and lamented that she was very tired. Initially, she thought she was strong, but she never expected to fall into this mud one day. Then she reminded Lisha to cherish her teammates. Noel brought the news to the prison for Hugo to see. Hugo felt that Noel was a bit cruel, but Noel didn't see it that way. That team was already distorted. He just made them realize their mistakes. Kaim at the tavern could only drink heavily to forget his sorrow. Seeing Kaim so depressed, the tavern owner had to speak up to remind him. Kaim was still young. This fall would help him mature, and he advised Kaim to continue on the path he had chosen. Despite such advice, Kaim couldn't forgive himself. His hands trembled. These very hands had stabbed Leon. That feeling still remained, just like at that moment. Kaim burst into tears, realizing he had been wrong. In that dangerous moment, Leon had simply made the best decision to protect his teammates. Why hadn't Kaim trusted Leon and instead became angry? He was the one who had betrayed Leon. The tavern owner tried to encourage Kaim. Indeed, Kaim's actions couldn't be excused anymore, but Kaim still had something to do if he wanted to make amends to Leon, help Leon achieve freedom. Kaim still didn't quite understand. The team had disbanded. Hadn't Leon already gained freedom? So the tavern owner had to enlighten Kaim. If Kaim felt guilty for stabbing Leon, then surely Leon was now feeling guilty for not trusting his teammates. That feeling of guilt had locked Leon in a mental prison, forever preventing Leon from being free, and the only person who could liberate Leon was Kaim. Meanwhile, Leon was being bullied by Edgar's group. He had been waiting for this opportunity for a long time. The kind of fake person like Leon was the type he hated the most. Not killing people or anything. While Leon was being praised, he was being ridiculed by others. Finally, there was an opportunity for revenge. Edgar pinned Leon against the wall, and Leon had no intention of resisting. At this moment, Noel and his group appeared, immediately beating up Edgar's disciples. Noel scolded Edgar harshly, making him very angry. However, when he ordered his disciples to attack, they were too scared and all ran away, leaving only Edgar to face Noel. Immediately, Noel cut off his nose, then grabbed his hair and threatened him. This time, he would spare him, but if there was a next time, it wouldn't be just him. His wife and child would also have to face his wrath. After letting Edgar leave, Noel got to the main business with Leon. He invited Leon to join his clan. The deputy leader position would be reserved for him. Of course, Leon refused. In his heart, Leon currently harbored a deep hatred for Noel. If it weren't for Noel, he wouldn't have had to disband his team. Seeing him still stubbornly misunderstanding, Noel had to give Leon another enlightenment session. Leon's team had already been distorted. The only one who could advance was Leon alone. The others always had to chase after him. As they aged, an invisible pressure would gradually form in their hearts. That's what would have caused Leon's team to break apart. Even if Noel hadn't intervened, the result would have been the same. Hearing this, Leon burst into tears. If he became Noel's teammate, wouldn't he be confirming himself as a traitor? Noel angrily shouted in Leon's face. His half-hearted emotions made him disgusted. But what had happened couldn't be undone. Leon's team had already disbanded, and Leon's bad reputation had spread far and wide. However, if Leon could continue to fight and become a seeker recorded in history, people would still remember Leon, remember the Celestial Wings Knights. Before Leon, Noel confidently declared that his goal was to become the strongest. To achieve that, Noel was ready to discard unnecessary emotions. Leon frowned and finally accepted Noel's request. He would monitor Noel throughout this journey, and if Noel had any deceitful words, death would be what Noel had to face. So Noel had recruited Leon into his team. Marion, sitting in the room, was a bit uncomfortable with Noel, as his methods were too cruel, and for Noel to be able to do that, Harold had been too kind to him. Harold himself felt the same way, but he promised Marion that from now on, this wouldn't happen again. Noel's recruitment of Leon into his team had helped his clan take a strong step forward. But everything was just beginning. Whether Noel's clan could survive or not depended on this next test. Harold had assigned Noel's clan a mission to exterminate a level 9 monster at Crystal Gorge, the Dragon King ruler of Death Spirits, Garm. On the street, when people saw Leon walking with Noel's group, they began to badmouth him as a traitor. Noel just gently reminded Leon not to mind those words. Being considered a traitor was better than being nameless. At this moment, Kaim appeared, cursing Noel, blaming him for causing his team to disband. Leon stepped up to stop Kaim. Now he was Noel's person. If Kaim still wanted to touch Noel, he would defeat Kaim first. The two rushed to attack each other, and obviously, Leon won. Kaim lay on the ground, bursting into tears. So this was Leon's answer. He would no longer hinder Leon, just wishing him success on the path he had chosen. That evening, Noel led everyone to the clan house. He had spent up to 20 million dong to buy it. A house too large but cheap must have a reason. Leon immediately recognized that this house had previously been an execution ground. Noel also explained that because it was an execution ground, there were some unclean things inside, but it didn't matter. Noel pulled out a skill book. This was a book teaching how to purify death spirits. Any spirit that dared to touch his people, he would send it on its way immediately. Then Noel gave each person a snake-shaped necklace. This would be the symbol of their guild, and the name of the clan would be Blue Wing Snake. The next test for the team began. Facing the level 9 monster Garm, it could summon countless undead to attack everyone. Noel and the team tried to resist it, but they could only kill its subordinate. By the time they encountered Garm, they were completely exhausted. They all had to run into a cave to hide. At this point, everyone had lost their ability to fight. Leon's hand was still holding his sword but trembling incessantly. Very quickly, Garm had caught up to them. It was preparing to attack them when Noel suddenly spoke up to stop it. He wanted to make a deal with it. From his pocket, Noel pulled out a spray bottle, claiming that this spray was very beneficial for Garm. The monster still didn't quite understand what Noel meant until its body began to feel strange. It was immediately paralyzed, and then Noel revealed to it that this was a specially formulated spray made from Alma's blood. This poison would paralyze the target for a few minutes, but to ensure it worked on Garm's body, Noel had set up a plan, deliberately letting the team be at a disadvantage and running to this cave. This place had been arranged by Noel beforehand. He had sprayed all the poison in this area. Colorless and odorless, the monster had fallen into the trap. With the monster's entire body paralyzed, unable to do anything, it was time for Noel to fire a shot, sending it to the scoreboard, ending the battle. Harold appeared to confirm with Noel that this achievement would make him more famous. But for Noel, this was nothing. Once again, before Harold, he declared that he was the grandson of Overdeath, and he would become the strongest seeker recorded in history. People asked how a toxsmith like Noel could become the strongest. Very simply, Noel would be the one to lead the strongest team, reaching the pinnacle of fame.